with open source models now almost as good as top closed source models like Claude or GPTs, it kind of makes you think, is open source really all good, or are there some dark sides to open source as well? So over this video, what we'll do is we'll explore the pros of open source and the cons of open source. So we'll explore it from the standpoint of us as individuals, companies, and for the companies who are actually open sourcing these models. I'll also give you some examples as and when relevant for each of the items that I mentioned. But before I jump in here, if you're new to this channel and you're looking to stay up to date with AI, this is what I do for a living, and I'd love to see you be a part of the community. With that out of the way, let's get started. We'll first start with the pros, and the number one is that it's your right. All of these AI models that we are using today have historically been trained on the data that was available on the internet. So Google, blogs, Reddit, social media, YouTube, so on and so forth. Where did all of this data or fuel come from? You and me. Every time you commented somewhere on the internet, every time you as a developer gave solution to a problem on the internet, every time you uploaded a blog on the internet, it contributed towards building a model that we are, or building models that we are using today. So in one way or the other, the data that was given by us was used to train the model, which is now being given back to us via the model itself. So in one way or the other, we do have some hand in building these AI models. And it's kind of in one way our right to have access to the model, and at least if not access, some transparency with respect to what's happening with the data. Second pro of an open source model is that you have complete control over it. When I say control, so if you're a company and you want to fine tune a model for a specific use case, then you can do it if you have access to already pre-trained open source model. So let's say if you take Llama 3's 8 billion or 9 billion parameter model and you want to build a model for mobile phones, you already have a great starting point. Not only that, you can fine tune that model with regards to what you want the model to do. So it will respond to you in a way you want the model to respond, and hence you have control over the model. And this brings me to the third point, which kind of talks about faster implementation. Now, because all of these models have some or the other understanding with respect to the basics of grammars, basic of maths, and so on and so forth, you don't have to do all of that training for the models. The company who open sourced it, and let's say Llama 3, already trained it to be better at math, do basic reasoning, and so on and so forth. So now when you want to teach it a new language, you just have to specifically train it for that language, and the model will learn faster, and hence your implementation is faster, which essentially also will reduce your costs to build an AI model that serves your customers in a specific language. Navrasa by Gemma is a great example of this use case because they used existing Gemma model to create a model is specific to a language here in India. The fourth point is the transparency, and it allows you to understand what is really going on behind the text prompts, right? So every time you write a text, there are a bunch of things that happen. So the first thing that will happen is that it will convert from the language that you share with the model to the language that the model actually understands. And post that, there are a bunch of these neural networks that do tasks A, B, C before they finally give you the response itself. All of this wouldn't be visible to you if the model wasn't with you, right? So open source kind of allows you that transparency to see what is really going on behind the text prompts. On top of this, it also gives you an understanding with respect to what a specific company is doing behind the curtains. One of the reasons why Elon Musk filed a lawsuit on OpenAI was because OpenAI wasn't very transparent with respect to what was really going on with the AGI development. And AGI development is going to impact the entire humanity once it becomes mainstream. So knowing what is going on behind the curtain becomes very, very important, and which is exactly why Elon Musk filed a lawsuit to get some transparency with respect to what the company is really doing. Now, in our scenario, since companies like Meta is open sourcing models like Llama 3.1, it kind of gives us an understanding that they are trying to build an AGI that is accessible by all. And it comes from the fact that models like Llama 3.1 and Llama 3 are good at math, which is very important from the AGI standpoint. So it gives us an understanding that the company is trying to move towards AGI, but it's very transparent with respect to all the developments that are happening behind the curtains. Again, you don't know what exactly is going on behind the curtains, but at least you know that whatever they are building is one way or the other related to the model that they are open sourcing. And transparency, to be honest, becomes very, very important, especially when companies are trying to build AGI. And there is this problem called misalignment in AI systems, which if machines that are conscious are misaligned with human values can harm humans, right? So having that transparency will be very important for not just individuals, but also other companies that are trying to build AI models. And this is also one of the cons, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But if you're interested in learning more about AGI, we have an entire course, and I'll put the link in the description. We kind of talk about all of these concepts like misalignment, levels of AGI, and so on and so forth in the course itself. The next pro is that it allows you to discover certain niche use cases which the company otherwise wouldn't be able to. Now, because Google open sourced Gemma model, a company like Navrasa was able to build a model that was specific to a smaller variant of, say, Telugu language here in India, which wouldn't have been possible by this large giant otherwise. So open source really allows you to kind of, drill down on these niche use cases, which larger companies will not, have benefit doing, right? So OpenAI will never launch a small model specifically fine-tuned for that language. But you as an individual having some market in that region will have some benefit to do that. The next pro is that you can use these models for your own learning. So let's say if you are trying to understand how AI models work, or how to build open source models, or how to fine tune these models, you can use these models as learning opportunity and then understand how the entire ecosystem of building or training an AI model really works behind the bars or behind the curtains. So let's say you're working on smaller use cases. Now, one of the use cases I can give you here is that I use Ollie in order to generate AI powered comments in the browser. Now, Ollie can connect with these, models locally. So my data is not going outside. I'm not sending any, post data or input data to OpenAI. I'm just sharing that data with the local model in my PC, which is Llama 3.1 in this scenario. And I'm able to generate a comment without sharing any information outside. If I turn off the internet, I will still be able to generate data. So it kind of promotes in one way or the other data security and privacy, because if there are certain pieces of data that you don't want to go or send outside your ecosystem, then these models can really help you do that. The second point here as well would be the fact that you can, as a company, you can host these models on your own, private cloud. And if your organization is working on summarizing certain data points, invoices, and so on, all of that you can do on your own cloud without sending all of this information outside to vendors like OpenAI, Cloud, and so on and so forth, or any closed source model for that matter. The next pro is the attraction of talent. Now, the fact that you're open sourcing models, so Llama 3.1 or Llama 3 received a lot of publicity after the open source model. And this is also true for Stable Diffusion models. They built a huge community of people who are now building on top of these open sourced models. So it kind of allows you to reach to these developers who you wouldn't be able to work with if your model wasn't open source. Now, some of these developers may like what they're working on, and they would want you to join, or they would want to join your company and work with you. So this is the benefit that open source offers. It allows you to not just get people, build community, but also, talent that might have really done well using the open source model that you might have open sourced. The next one is the potential to become like an industry standard. So when you judge a lot of open source models, let's say in image generation and text generation today, the benchmark is for image generation, you would look at Stable Diffusion if you're looking at open source. And for text generation, you would use Llama 3.1. For a very long time, a company called Mistral was a good industry standard for judging these large language models. And that was a relatively small company, but they received investment from the likes of Microsoft, right? So even if you're a small company, you open source your models, it's likely that you will catch attention of a giant, and not just giant, but a bunch of different people from around the world who will now be a part of your community and help you build your models or your company in general. So Mistral initially open sourced their models, and then they started launching their closed source model for European markets. And guess what? They did receive paid users for their paid models as well. So it can also be a marketing strategy in a way, but I wouldn't recommend doing that, because a lot of people did catch a wind of that and didn't really work out well from the brand standpoint. Talking about brand, if you stick to open source, you have the potential to accelerate your brand visibility. Now, if Mistral would have stuck to open source, they might have still been the industry standard, because they launched a model called Mistral Large, which was really, really good at that time, but it wasn't open source, right? So it did impact the brand visibility. But if they might have stuck to open source, then they probably might have become the industry standard for the open source large language models, and might have worked with the likes of Meta, who they recently challenged after Meta launched Llama 3.1. So it means that they're working towards building a model, open source model, that is almost as good as Llama 3.1, which is what makes open source really exciting. And finally, faster innovation. Now, because you have a model that is, fine-tuned for almost doing all the things in the world, you can use the model for building internal use cases that might have not been possible otherwise. So let's say if you are a legacy company and you want to automate your invoices using these open source large language models, you will now be able to do so. But then again, these are all the pros about the open source, and I'm also going to be showing you a graph that kind of talks about how open source will eventually catch up with closed source in the future, and I'll show that near the end of the video, but because I first want to talk about the cons now. So let's talk about the cons. I know this video has gone relatively longer, but I hope you're getting value. From the con standpoint, number one, it requires significant tech expertise. So if you don't have people in tech in your company, building an open source model or fine-tuning an open source model is going to be a task. All of this is code, so there is no direct way to fine-tune a model without knowing how to run code. Even simpler frameworks like Llama do require you to use terminal, which is easy, but you might need some familiarity with how code works. You will now not have any professional support, which is expected in scenario where things are open source, but you will have community support, which is going to be way more useful than having like a professional support, which will take 24 hours for you to respond. You can join Discord and get answers to your problems immediately. One of the things that happens with a lot of small open source companies that they make a lot of changes. So there are obviously chances that whatever model you're using today might go through some changes and you might need to update the model. And Llama 3.1 is a great example. Llama 3 was launched and they recently launched Llama 3.1, which is an improved version of Llama 3. So now the companies who integrated Llama 3 also now want to move to Llama 3.1 because it's better. So you need to dynamically keep moving every time, which depending on what is the best open source model out there. And you would be better off to just buy, a third party vendor who's hosting open source model. But then how is that different from, using closed source models per se? Fourth, if you're planning to run these models locally, some of these requires crazy amount of hardware, which is not possible for most of us because the whole Gen AI buzz recently started, right? I think 2 to 3 years back. So most of us don't have, laptops or computers that support that. Obviously, AI PCs and AI laptops are now becoming mainstream, but that wasn't the case a few years back. So most of us probably don't have access to these powerful computers. And the fifth point is that you might essentially end up spending more than saving by integrating open source because, like I said, you have to constantly update new models. And if you have not optimized the model correctly, you might end up spending more on cloud costs than otherwise. So if you don't know what you're doing, it's ideal to kind of get someone in tech who will know what they are doing when it comes to the open source integration. And hiring these tech folks can also be more expensive. So if you're a smaller company, why not just use closed source models, APIs that are already created and just, integrate those in your app. And now from the standpoint of companies who open source these models, they will effectively, if it's a small company, they will lose access or exclusive access to the model. And second, they will also potentially lose the competitive advantage that they might have had in case they might have not open sourced the model itself. In fact, some company may actually use the model that you open source, build a better model by fine-tuning the model and then compete with you. So that's a huge con for companies that are open sourcing these models. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is the monetization. Now, because the company open sourced the model, there is no direct way for them to make money. Obviously, while they have a huge community, the community is not going to pay as such because the model itself is free to use, which is again a huge problem for companies that are small. And one of the examples here is Stable Diffusion or Stability AI. The founder Imad Mustaqil left the company, and a lot of people suspected that he left primarily because the monetization of the company wasn't figured out, which is true in this case. Like if you're open sourcing models, how are you going to make money if you don't have a platform? People are just using your proprietary models and fine-tuning and uploading it on their own cloud, and they're paying to the cloud vendors, but they won't pay to you. And if you sell it as an API, how are you different than a closed source model? So monetization becomes an issue. Now, if you're a company like Llama, you probably don't face this. But if you're a company like Stability AI or Mistral, it's a huge problem monetization wise. Second, as a company, you're also responsible to maintain and support the model that you have open source. Now, Certain customers might have integrated the previous versions of your models, while certain people might have integrated the new versions of your models. So you need to support them across the board, right? So that becomes a problem because you don't necessarily want to support the old models, because that's why they're called old models, right? But people might have already integrated initially when you might have launched that model per se. And the next point is around legal issues that may arise because of misuse, and this is huge. But this is also true for closed source models. Open source models can be used in order to generate images that are not safe for work, or generate text that may not be suitable for certain age groups. So let's say how to build a bomb for that example, right? Now, while open source models are in general, tuned to ensure that they don't answer questions like these, there are obviously ways to jailbreak it. But then that's not very different for closed source models as well. In fact, Claude published their own papers on how it was possible to jailbreak the closed source models that are available today. So the problems with misuse will continue to exist with both closed and open source, but they are more likely to happen with open source because the users have access to the model. Now, obviously, Claude will make changes to the model and ensure that you're not able to jailbreak. But the users will actually make changes to the model such that they're always able to jailbreak the model, right? So misuse is a huge problem when it comes to open source, and probably one of the reasons why a lot of people are skeptical about open source in general. The next point is around the openness and the IP issues. So for companies that are open sourcing these models, it is kind of hard for them to balance what the users should be able to get in the model versus what they shouldn't be able to get in the model. So let's say if there is a proprietary code from some other application that they would want to integrate in the open source model, now it becomes a hurdle for them to open source the model because they now have the proprietary code from the model that is not open source, right? Or the application that is not open source. So they have to kind of balance to ensure that they don't open source things that are not supposed to be open source, right? And the final point around the cons is that it's harder to get started if you don't know how AI models work or how these open source models operate in general, and you need a tech person to teach you who will charge you $300 to $400, which will be enough for you to run OpenAI API for years to come. So again, it depends on where you are, who you are, what you're doing, what you're working on before you decide if open source is for you or not for you. These are the pros and cons I want to talk about. And then finally, I mentioned I'll talk about the graph that shows you how open source will eventually catch up with closed source. So let me just quickly show that graph to you. So this is the graph that I was talking about. You can see in April 22, the closed source models were way above open source models in MMLU, which is the reasoning benchmark. And now you can see over time how open source models are now almost as good as closed source models when it comes to reasoning, which is a huge thing, like I said, for AGI, because Llama 3.1 405 billion parameter model is better than Claude 3.5 Sonnet when it comes to reasoning. And founders like Mark Zuckerberg believe that open source will eventually surpass closed source in the years to come. And I personally think that's going to be the case as well. But how long that is going to take is not very clear. But based on the developments and the speed that you see in the graph, we are not too far. And that's all I wanted to talk about through the video itself, guys. If you think this video added value to you, feel free to, subscribe to the channel and also subscribe to the newsletter if you would want to continue reading stuff like this. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.